It had been building across 3 weeks of studying that document, and across 6 years of occupation, and across 47 years of a life that had prepared me, without my knowing it was preparing me, for exactly this sequence of choices. I took the document. I took nothing else. I left my rosary on the desk beside the extinguished candle, and my winter habit on the hook behind the door, and the small photograph of my parents that had sat on my windowsill for 19 years. And I took the document and I ran, and the convent burned behind me. And what I was carrying in my hands through that burning corridor and out into the July night was something that I did not fully understand for another 3 months, and that when I did understand it completely, changed the futures of more people than I have ever been able to count. My name is Sister Serafina Ostrowska, and I had been at the Convent of the Holy Trinity in Zamashk for 19 years when it burned, and I want to tell you the full story of how I came to be sitting at that desk at midnight with that specific document, because the full story is the only version that makes honest sense of what I did and why. I entered the convent at 28, after 8 years working as a legal copyist in Warsaw, a profession that required me to read and transcribe legal documents with complete accuracy, and had given me, by the time I took my vows, a working knowledge of legal language and document structure across property law, inheritance law, commercial law, and ecclesiastical law that was more comprehensive than most practicing lawyers of the period possessed, because lawyers specialize and copyists transcribe everything, and everything teaches you in ways that specialization does not. I brought that knowledge into the convent and applied it primarily to the administration of the convent's own legal affairs, which were more complex than outsiders might expect for an institution that had been accumulating property, resolving disputes, and managing relationships with civil authorities since its founding in 1763. I was not formally trained in law. I was comprehensively educated in it by 19 years of reading everything that came across my desk with complete attention, which is a different kind of qualification, and in some respects a more reliable one. The document came to me through Father Kazimierz Vronsky, who was the elderly parish priest of the village of Nilish, 12 kilometers from Zamość, and who arrived at the convent on the 23rd of June, 1944, in a state of agitation that he was attempting to conceal with the dignity appropriate to a man of 74, and mostly failing. He asked to speak with me specifically, which I noted because visitors to the convent did not typically ask for me by name unless they had legal or financial matters requiring attention. Father Vronsky had been the parish priest of Nilish for 41 years, and in that time he had been the repository for the private affairs of the community in the way that long-serving rural priests inevitably become, knowing the secrets and the sorrows and the financial realities of every family in the parish across 4 decades of births and deaths and marriages and the transactions that accumulate between them. He had been keeping a specific secret for 22 years, since 1922, when a dying man named Alexander Zamenhof had pressed a document into his hands and asked him to preserve it until the appropriate moment, and then to bring it to someone who could understand it and act on it correctly. And Father Vronsky had preserved it for 22 years in the only truly secure location available to a rural parish priest, which was the locked box behind the altar tabernacle where he kept the reserved sacrament, because no German soldier and no Soviet agent and no civil official in 41 years had ever thought to look there. He had decided, he told me, that the appropriate moment had arrived, not because the situation had improved, but because he was 74 years old, and his heart was not reliable, and he could not be certain he would survive long enough to find a better moment. And a document of this nature sitting in a locked box behind an altar tabernacle, with no one who knew it was there except its keeper, was a document that would be lost the moment its keeper died, and losing it felt to him like a betrayal of the dying man who had trusted him 22 years earlier. He gave me the document in a leather folder that had been made specifically to hold it, well crafted, designed to protect the contents from moisture and light, and he told me the outline of what it contained, and asked me to study it carefully and to tell him whether what Alexander Zamenhof had believed about it was correct. Then he went back to Nilish, And 8 days later, I learned through the diocesan communication network that Father Ronsky had died in his sleep on the 1st of July, his heart having made its own decision about timing. And I was the only person alive who knew the document existed. Alexander Zamenhof had been the younger brother of Ludwig Zamenhof, the creator of Esperanto, and he had been, in his own less celebrated way, a man of considerable affairs. He had been involved in the pre-war Polish art market, specifically in the acquisition and private sale of significant works that their owners, for various reasons, preferred to move discreetly rather than through public channels. Over 20 years of this work, he had assembled documentation, meticulous and legally precise documentation, in the manner of a man who understood that the value of what he was handling required records that would survive any challenge to their legitimacy. Of the provenance, ownership history, and physical location of 31 significant artworks that had been moved through his hands between 1898 and 1920. These were not minor works. The document included paintings by artists whose names I recognized even in my convent existence as belonging to the first rank of European art. It included the specific record of where 11 of these works had been physically concealed by their owners in the years before and during the First World War, owners who in several cases had died before retrieving them, and whose heirs, if they existed, did not know the locations that Alexander Zamenhof had recorded. It included, in the careful legal language that I recognized from my years of copyist work as the language of formal testament and deposition, Alexander Zamenhof's sworn statement that this documentation was complete, accurate, and represented his full knowledge of the works and their locations as of the date of his death in 1922. I spent 3 weeks studying it. I want you to understand what that means in practical terms. 3 weeks of reading and rereading a complex legal and historical document by candlelight in a convent in occupied Poland in the summer of 1944, cross-referencing the names and dates and locations against everything I knew from my legal copyist background, and everything I could access from the convent's library, and the limited correspondence I could conduct without raising questions I was not ready to answer. By the 14th July, I had reached the following conclusions. The document was genuine. The legal language and structure were consistent with documents of the 1920s period and contained no anachronisms that would suggest later fabrication. The provenance records for the 31 works were detailed in ways that would be very difficult to invent convincingly. And the locations specified for the 11 concealed works were specific enough to be actionable, which is the legal copyist's word for a document that contains sufficient precision to be used as the basis for real action, rather than simply as a record of intention. I had also reached the conclusion that this document, in the summer of 1944, was one of the most dangerous things in the Zamosk region to be in possession of. The German occupation had been systematically looting Polish cultural property for 5 years. The specific network of officials responsible for identifying and extracting significant artworks operated with a thoroughness and a violence that meant that anyone known to possess information about concealed artworks of the caliber described in Alexander Zamenhof's document would not remain in possession of either the document or their safety for very long. Father Ronsky had been right to keep it behind the tabernacle. He had been right that it needed to be moved. And he had been right, though he had not lived to know it, that bringing it to me was the correct decision, because I was the person in that region at that moment who had the combination of legal knowledge to understand it fully and the institutional position to potentially protect it. I had been thinking about how to protect it when the fire started. The fire was not accidental. I understood this within the first minute of being aware of it, not because I had evidence in that minute, but because the speed of it, and the location of it, and the specific night of it combined to produce a conclusion that my mind reached before my body had finished registering the alarm. The East Wing housed the convent's administrative offices and records room. It was where the legal documents and property records and correspondence archives of 181 years of institutional life were stored. someone had decided that those archives needed to burn, and they had chosen a July night when the occupation's grip on the region was tightening in ways that made record destruction a reasonable strategic objective for people with reasons to be concerned about what old records might establish. Whether they knew about Father Wansky's documents specifically, or were conducting a more general destruction of institutional memory, I have never determined. What I determined in those 4 minutes was that the document in my hands was the reason I needed to leave immediately, and that leaving immediately was also the only available option, regardless. I went through the window of my cell rather than the corridor because the corridor already had smoke moving through it in the low, purposeful way that smoke moves when a fire is well established rather than just beginning. The window opened onto the narrow ledge above the kitchen garden, a drop of perhaps 3 meters to the garden below, and I made that drop with the document held against my chest with one arm and landed badly on my left ankle, and got up and kept moving because stopping to assess the ankle was not an option the situation offered. I went through the kitchen garden and through the gate in the garden wall and into the lane behind the convent, and I stood in the lane in my night clothes, with a leather folder pressed against my chest, and I watched the east wing burn, and I heard the sisters beginning to emerge from the main entrance, and I counted them 14, 15, 16, all present, and I allowed myself one moment of relief before I began thinking about what came next. What came next was 8 months of the most demanding navigation I had managed in 47 years of life, and I had managed some demanding navigation. I could not stay in Zamashk. A nun from a burned convent carrying a document of that sensitivity in an occupied city was not a stable situation. I had contacts through the diocesan network and through the legal community I had served as a copyist, contacts that stretched to Krakow and Warsaw, and in one case to London through a Polish exile network that had been operating since 1939. I used those contacts systematically and carefully, moving the document through 3 different secure locations across the autumn and winter of 1944, ensuring at each stage that enough people who could be trusted knew of its existence, that its loss could not be accomplished simply by removing me from the situation. The document reached London in February 1945, carried by a courier from the Exile Network, whose name I will not record here, because recording names of couriers is the habit that gets couriers killed, and some habits formed in dangerous times should be maintained even after the danger has passed. It reached the hands of people with the legal standing and the international connections to begin the process of verification and restitution that a document of that nature required. That process took years, as such processes do, moving through the slow machinery of post war legal reconstruction and the competing claims of survivors and governments and institutions, all attempting simultaneously to recover what the war had taken. But it moved, and it concluded, and 11 works that Alexander Zamenhof had recorded the locations of were found in the locations he had specified. Because a dying man's precise records had survived 22 years in a locked box, and 3 weeks on a desk, and 4 minutes in a burning corridor, and 8 months of occupied Poland navigation, and a February crossing to London. Surviving all of those things because at each critical moment, someone had made the decision to carry it forward rather than set it down. I received a letter in 1951 from a legal representative in Paris informing me that the restitution process for 7 of the 11 recovered works had been completed, and that the document I had preserved had been the decisive instrument in establishing the legal basis for those restorations to their rightful inheritors. 7 families, works that connected them to the people they had come from, and the world those people had inhabited before the war had attempted to erase it. I read that letter in the convent in Lublin, where I had been living since 1945, and I thought about the 4 minutes in the burning corridor, and the 3 meters from the window ledge to the kitchen garden, and the ankle that had healed imperfectly and still ached in cold weather. And I thought about Father Wamsky dying in his sleep on the 1st of July, with his secret safely transferred and his obligation discharged. And I thought about Alexander Zamenhof in 1922, pressing a leather folder into the hands of a parish priest and asking him to wait for the appropriate moment, trusting that the appropriate moment would come and that the right person would be there to meet it. I was that person. I did not choose to be. I was simply the one who was awake at midnight with a candle and 47 years of preparation and 4 minutes to decide what mattered enough to carry through a burning building. It turned out that the answer to that question, when the question is asked in earnest by a fire at 20 past 2 in the morning, is not what you expect it to be. It is never the rosary on the desk or the photograph on the windowsill. It is always the thing that belongs to more people than just you. It is always the thing that carries other people's futures inside it. That is what you run with. That is what you save.